Hello and welcome to our Theory of Practice tutorial. Now, unlike our workshop-specific tutorials, these Theory of Practice tutorials are a chance to answer questions and address topics from right across our educational program, including all of our workshops and our consultations. And this week we once again have a rather eclectic range of questions and topics to consider, all the way from one's sense of purpose and the transcendence of straight documentary photography in order to enable something else in our photography and what we're doing. Also, critical distinctions about workflow components and the distinctions we base our decisions on about the tools we decide to use and those we decide not to use, both in an attempt to streamline what we do, but also for stability and also for protection from being overwhelmed by the choices and conflicting possibilities that are available. Big decisions that require carefully thought out answers. Also questions about aesthetic effect and psychological priorities in our image processing, including blending different domain separations and their recombinatory influence on pictorial outcomes like enhanced presence and expanded dimensionality in our pictures. Plus a reoccurring proposition dealing with the material and aesthetic distinctions between printing papers in support of their selection, let alone adaptation for different images and their printing outcomes. We're very much looking forward to addressing all of these considerations. So let's have a look at those specific dot points that we've sequenced for this tutorial. This first dot point, I think, underlies a lot of recent discussions we've had. And in particular, a dear friend came back to us saying, I've heard you speak on numerous occasions about in order to make something, you have to find it. Or vice versa, having to find something in photography in order to make a picture of it, and asking us to elaborate. And of course, this is going to be absolutely fascinating to discuss, using Andre and myself as a peg in the ground to compare and contrast different tendencies in photography, different points of departure, if you like. That'll be an interesting way to set the scene, I think, for today's tutorial as we then dig deeper and deeper. For example, look at the second dot point. And this has really just started to erupt now that Affinity, not just Affinity Photo, but the whole Affinity suite is free, 100% free. Unless you want the AI enhancements, then there's an annual subscription. Even more than normal, we are finding people coming to us really torn. Do I stay with Photoshop? Do I go to Affinity? Or for those who are wanting to add advanced compositing and blending and other attributes to their image processing, editing workflow, do I pay Adobe subscriptions every month or do I use free Affinity Photo? And apart from financial considerations, what else is there that I should be cognizant of? And we've just put together 10 dot points of difference as to how we consider this, some of the strengths and weaknesses of Affinity as it currently is, not just that it's free, but how it affects or implements or enables our workflows to prosper. So that's going to be a fascinating little demonstration of some of those dot points. Then a really big question I alluded to in the introduction, file formats, various file formats. And while the statistics around our different file formats can be easily sourced and understood, it's really their implications in our overall workflows, what they do enable or don't enable, and the echoes that emanate from those considerations that affect everything that follows. So really interesting, and I've tagged this with this generic idea of, is there an appropriate or more appropriate or most appropriate format for what I do? So let's have a look at some real-world examples and discuss that as well. Procedural, process-oriented topics. Another friend earlier in the week asked about contrast. So they understand contrast, as in contrast in a black and white image, a classic black and white photograph. And though they can apply that imaginatively to their full gamut color photographs, they really are seeking more clarity, perhaps, to tension the distinctions between tonal contrast and color contrast. And then, of course, we can go way beyond that into tensioning contrast, difference, separation in our spatial and temporal compositions. But just some clear distinctions to begin with, and some demonstrations of what we think of when we think of contrast in the color composition as opposed to contrast in the tonal composition. And then, as I will demonstrate, how that then feeds itself into remarkable spatial and temporal compositions, those things that enable our pictures to go beyond just capturing the referent, what was in front of the lens, to go way beyond that and capture hearts and minds, as we like to say, independently of what was in front of the lens, and indeed to even transcend one's own expectations. Then that perennial question, which I never tire of addressing, and hopefully I've got some interesting ways of thinking about this today. This idea of selecting our printing papers for our digital inkjet printing pathways, and particularly in fine art printing, where quality and other aesthetic considerations of your own making often, rather than being universal distinctions, come to the fore and really demand us to pay some critical attention. But tagged with this idea of, look, Les, I know you print on 64 different media, in particular the Canson Affinity range of papers. Now, of course we do. We love them to death for all the reasons we've gone over in the printing workshops. But if I just want to simplify things, just one or maybe two papers, what would you suggest? Now, of course, in asking for our opinion, we can tell you what we love and what we do and why we do it. But it's just our opinion. It's just evidence of our prejudice, evidence of our bias, evidence of what we care about, not what you care about. And though emulation is a critical component of any artistic workflow, any evolution of one's creative practice, admiring something and go, whoa, how can I make my version of that? And so on and so forth. Let's pare that back a little. Let's have a look at some critical material, but also aesthetic distinctions, at least from our point of view, that you may find hopefully worthwhile considerations to enable your own conversation with these inkjet printing papers and what you're hoping to achieve, let alone the surprises that lie waiting for you around every corner of such an undertaking. Let's see if any of that helps your language and your understanding, hence your conversation about such things with yourself, let alone friends and colleagues. And we're going to do this through a concept I've worked with from my earliest days of comparing and contrasting paper pairs. Now, it seems from some recent workshops, this idea of understanding our images through these different domains, colorimetric domains, luminance domains, spatial domains, and so forth, has piqued interest in a lot of you. So asking for more examples of spatial domain masking and blending. I thought, yeah, sure, okay, we can do that till the cows come home. But then another question in response to a recent black and white digital image workshop tutorial, where I used our enhanced shadow separation action from the Photoshop or Affinity macro set from that workshop and blending it into one of the submitted images. And this friend was blown away by the result. So again, asking for more examples. Can you do this with your other actions? Are there ways of further manipulating or enhancing or promulgating what these actions of ours, these enhancements, already do? Now, I thought those last two dot points, they're really variations on the one theme, so I'm going to combine them together, both to very quickly revisit what we did in the recent black and white digital image workshop tutorial. I've still got my friend's image to demonstrate that, but also to extend that and to drag other bits and pieces from other workshops and recent tutorials in support of some of those other workshops into the mix, so we can then certainly look at a few more things that we actually do on quite a regular basis. All in the aim, once again, going all the way back to that very first dot point, this idea of how does one's creation and its priorities, the things that we are doing it on behalf of, the reasons for this, that, and the other, let alone the rationales that we justify such effort, such intrigue with, go all the way back to basically that first topic and trying to insert these process-driven outcomes into an overarching methodology. And this idea of making something in order to find it, or having to find something in order to take a photograph of it. And not just the distinctions, but the priorities, the understandings, those conceptual frameworks that those simple distinctions represent, and how they then enable us to move forward with less certainty and maybe more confidence than previously. Take what we're doing to the next level and beyond as we try to constantly not just engage with, but involve our own creative process and the things that we care about and desire beyond anything else. So there's the lie of the land, there's the setup. Once again, like all of our tutorials, trying to make it a circular journey, an undertaking where we just don't depart and leave behind, but circle back to include and reinforce earlier distinctions, earlier considerations, in the hope that they will actually be of some use, some meaning, and enable you to develop what it is that you're already doing. If not, at the very least, just simply support it. All right, let's see how we go. And consider this first dot point and this tension between finding in order to make and making in order to find what it is we're doing, and the implications that has for all manner of discursive and other things in our overall workflows. Now, I'm going to do this by initially looking at the production of some of our images. For example, here we are in the studio. There's Andre in the background controlling things with his large rear projection screen. There's the Hasselblad on the studio stand. We're setting up lighting in order to create a setting, to create the staging of, the performance of an undertaking, not out there on the street, not down at the beach or up in the mountains, but here in a studio, where what is going to be the subject of the photograph is something we have set about making and constructing for the sake of photography. Still using photography rather than paint or whatever, simply because of the authority and the sheer beauty that photography renders such things, but doing it for the ability to create something more than just the photographed moment. Here's another view from up high, looking down at the rear of Andre's handmade rear projection screen, a massive Canon projector, and so forth. And again, the camera system, where the performances will be staged, and this setup and this undertaking, where even the lighting is being constructed. It is, as Andre likes to say, not so much the decisive moment, but the constructed moment. And this premise, this movement of priorities, of emphasis on what one does, not just how one does what one does. Contemporary fine art photography, through its monumental scale, constructed realities, and narrative storytelling, has overseen a shift from the representation of drama, what's happening in the street, to the drama of representation. That is a shift from the decisive moment to the constructed moment. Now, if we put that into this context of having to make something to find it versus having to find something to make it, this is a simple way, I think, of staging this dichotomy between, for an overused term, let's say traditional straight photography, and what for many decades now, certainly from the early 1980s, we have worked in the world of contemporary art. We have worked with this idea of making, constructing, building the occasion for the photograph. Now, this is not because we don't love and admire straight photography at its best. Well, I could spend all day in front of Atchley or Walker Evans and so on. Absolutely. But it's about trying to do something more than straight photography. Why, though? What's the matter with straight photography? If I'm happy to look at incredible examples of straight photography from morning to night and enrich myself, and entertain myself, engage myself with such incredible contributions, why not straight photography? Why not just find that scene in the real world and document it? Well, putting aside ethical and privacy and all sorts of other issues, especially when it comes to private property and individuals, putting aside those thorny topics for the moment, there's something else going on here. And let's try and tease this out and make it hopefully as legible for you, even if you disagree with it, even if it's not something you yourself decide to engage with or aren't interested in engaging with or aren't engaging with at all. Let's just at least try and present the thinking behind us and many other contemporary artists over all these decades as to where and how we came to such an understanding, not taking anything away from the beauty and the eloquence of traditional straight documentary photography. For example, here's one of Andre's constructions, using his rear projection, himself as a model to stage this drama, images from some of his favourite filmmakers. He's working in that nexus we now call photo cinema, and these are some of his still cinema portrayals. And this idea that photography that is actively engaged in the construction of fictions or alternate realities, and this shift from predominantly documentary photography to constructed photography, has greatly expanded the stories that we can tell. Now, that is a key distinction here, the stories that photography can tell. I need to flesh that out a little more. And remember Andre's From the Decisive to the Constructed Moment, this move from the representation of drama in front of the lens, found in the street, on the beach, in the mountains, wherever, to the representation of drama. From the decisive moment to the constructed moment. It is about the means and the mechanism by which what we photograph has been put into play. Now, why are we so concerned with this? For decades now in the world of contemporary art. I'll speak personally for a moment. In growing up and finding myself interested in photography, way back then, I was primarily interested in photography for its political engagements with the world as a dominant media messaging of our time, led me to wonder about and investigate not so much photography, but to ask that telling question, what is photography? And a lot of philosophers and art historians and others were writing about it at the time. I'm talking about the 1970s. And it dawned on me quite quickly, having come from a background of philosophy, thinking about thinking, painting, drawing, and music and what have you, it dawned on me that because with photography you have to find something in order to make a photograph of it. You have to discover it in the world, the referent. Rather than starting with that blank canvas, that blank sheet of paper, 26 letters of the alphabet, but almost infinite permutations of words, phrases, and let alone the poetics of placing them, tensioning them together, apart, and so on. I just felt as beautiful as straight photography at its absolute best is and can be. I felt hamstrung compared to my friends painting or writing or composing and performing music. I just felt that I didn't have that range of options and techniques because I'm having to deal with what I discover, what I find in order to make a photograph of it. Hence, I really quickly became enamored with and very interested in technical problems, fascinated by overcoming technical limitations in photography. We're going to look at some of these outcomes later in this tutorial. But it was that distinction that, as wonderful as straight documentary photography is, it was so reliant on what we found, on the referent. Whereas, like Andre, I was wanting to tell my stories of my world, of my time, not other people's stories of their world. So I started photographing in my own backyard, metaphorically, of course. But we very quickly moved, like Andre has continued, to build the things that were then the occasion for the beautiful, straight, modernist photographic rendering of them. This is back in 1978, after I'd spent a good number of years experimenting with using large 8x10 sheets of film and beginning to enlarge those, no longer contact printing. This is a 40-inch tall print framed and exhibited on a gallery wall. This is also a fiction, a construction, these wonderful National Geographic maps of my childhood, cutting up and reassembling the way that they map something else. This is where that distinction of mine we've talked about in other tutorials and other workshops between the world of photography dividing between portraits of things and maps of territories. This was the first iteration, where instead of a map of the territory of the world as presented by National Geographic, I reconstructed this map in slices to create a fictional world. Now, as is so often the case with these annotations, the way I sliced through these maps, you couldn't read any of these stories in their entirety that were pointing to particular areas or soliloquies or what have you to do with these locations in this territory, this map, except way over here, there was a story in its entirety where on this island, a volcanic eruption apparently killed everyone except the town despot, the drunk, who was locked up overnight in the police cell, and he survived as a result. The irony, but hopefulness of survival in the face of madness was there for you to find. And of course, this is a print that's 50 inches wide. So from a distance, taking it all in as we're seeing it here, but it's only when you engage with it in a gallery setting that you get close enough to be able to see the disrupted annotations, but at the same time, discover the one annotation that was whole and take its meaning from the experience. And the title is Nothing Is As It Appears. All right, so there's another example of this idea we came to with others, historians, artists, and philosophers, and so on, in inquiring as to the nature of what photography is. Not what does it do. In the 1970s, we knew very well what it did. We had a huge history of evidence at our doorstep. But that idea of going beyond, and that idea of doing something else, and coming to that realization that we needed to construct, to make something in order to find what it is we're trying to articulate, to put forward that as a point of departure, rather than the beautiful, but in our view, somewhat limited straight documentary tradition. Nevertheless, still using the most beautiful lenses, the most beautiful processes, chemical, physical, in order to render these thoughts, feelings, and concerns. So that move from the decisive moment to the constructed moment, that's a hallmark of so much contemporary art over decades and decades now. I guess really coming to a height in the early to mid-1980s, where we start getting these massive tableau works, photographic works beginning to appear on the scale previously reserved more or less for history paintings, and then inviting us to engage above and beyond just the painted surface, its form, its content, its representation, to move us and take us somewhere else with the authority of photography, with the beauty of the highest quality of photographic representations, but straight away not through a portal into the world of appearances, but deep into our metaphorical and imaginative worlds that we live within and that live within us. So there's a few answers and hopefully clarifications as to where, when we throw those, make something to find it and find something to make it, phrases around, that it gives a little more backbone, a little more structure to what it is that we're implying, let alone are interested in. And hopefully that might be of some interest to you. At the very least, there's something to disagree with if that comes your way. Okay, so let's look at this second dot point. And as I said, this has come to us from numerous quarters, most recently. And I think in part this has got to do with a growing awareness of alternatives to Adobe for a whole raft of reasons. From the most obvious, the objection to a subscription model, the ransomware, we find some people describing it as, to a different way of engaging with imaging applications, from gatekeeping to creative generosity and support. So I thought, from our point of view, let's put up 10 considerations that matter to us as to why Affinity versus, let's say, Photoshop. And when you're talking Photoshop, of course, we're talking Lightroom/Photoshop, with Lightroom being the front end, the cataloging and so forth, that Photoshop never had, but now for 20-odd years has enjoyed its development, let alone how Lightroom has evolved into a standalone application. Now, the first dot point is pretty obvious, isn't it? Affinity is completely free, but it also combines vector imaging, illustration, with design, publishing, layout, with the photo persona, with photo editing capabilities, all in one seamless application. Now, of course, we've always been able to move files from Illustrator to InDesign or Photoshop to Illustrator to InDesign and so on, but the inconsistencies have been mind-numbingly stupid. Different color management regimes, for example, in those three applications, not so in Affinity. And on it goes. Also, this fascinating distinction. You can pay a subscription to Affinity, but all it does is it enables the AI enhancements, the AI tools to be activated. If you have no use for AI tools, then it's completely free. That so often friends say, my monthly subscription to Adobe has increased dramatically, but all they've given me is all this AI that I have no interest in and no use for. Now, it's not just that there's no catalog in Affinity. Instead, Affinity says we have no interest in forcing your asset management. The way Lightroom, you can't access a file without importing it, or Capture One, which says, are you working in sessions, or are you working in catalogs, or are you working in a catalog of sessions? No, Affinity says, no way would we force that upon you, your file asset management. No way. It's completely up to you as to how you do that. We are more than happy to play with whatever cataloging or other devices. And of course, we've gone on and on, not just in our cataloging and archiving workshop, we've gone on and on in other workshops about using not the Lightroom catalog or the Capture One catalogs, because they only enable us to catalog what that program will process and all sorts of other limitations. We want a single cataloging system. We don't want to be jumping between different catalogs to find different things, let alone associations and so on. Let's now look at some of these operating considerations, what we would class as significant advantages or disadvantages. So let's jump into Affinity. We now have our studios up here, the vector, illustration, our layout, design, publishing, and of course our pixel studio. And here is a custom studio that I've made that replicates what I like to do, and the entities, layers, channels, histories, all of our macros from our workshops and so on. At the moment, I'm using this image because I use it in the Affinity Photo Workflows workshop to demonstrate a number of fundamental things. And let's go down to our shortcuts. Here we have the ability, including things as obvious as white balance. Why on earth didn't Photoshop make white balance an adjustment layer 30 years ago? It beggars disbelief. And they are live filter layers in my layer stack, just like curves or white balance or HSL, HSV adjustment layers that I can blend and mask. And how simple. No smart objects, no silliness like that. No, whatever you want to do, you can do it. I also can blend on a prodigious range of blending modes, far more extensive than what is available in Photoshop. But even more than that, everywhere blending modes appear within Affinity, unlike Photoshop, all of the same blending modes apply to that tool, to that agent, or whatever it is. There is no ifs or buts. Another key feature for us is applying, let's say, a curve adjustment layer. I'll just move this across so we can see it. Now, just like in Photoshop, there's our curve adjustment layer, there's our visibility icon, there's our blendings and our blend ifs and so forth. But what I want to look at is the range of color models I can apply to this image. Now, this image is an RGB image. There's my combined red plus green plus blue histogram. It's in color, showing us the red, green, and blue composites are very helpful. But no, I'm going way beyond that. There's the master, and there's the individual channels. We can even edit alpha. Brilliant. But look at this. Without having to convert my RGB image into CMYK or LAB or grayscale to get access to these tools, I select CMYK, and that gives me CMYK histogram. There's my black channel where I can change the gray component replacement in those areas and add contrast and detail into those shadows, into those highlights. And I can add any number of masks to a single adjustment layer. So no smart objects, no silliness like that. Everything is of the same ilk. There's such incredible equality spread right across its operations and its abilities. The same keyboard shortcut in Affinity, except 100% non-destructive. I'm on a Mac, so Command M brings up our curves, except curves on an adjustment layer, not destructive curves, levels, color balance, and so on, as in Photoshop. And on it goes. Extraordinary things that we can get amongst. Some of the shortcomings, though, that I've got to say are still really disappointing. No input profiling. Look, let's not kid ourselves. The default renderings, even for my Phase 1 IQ4 150 digital back, the default renderings are very impressive with no control over those input profiles. But that's for pictorial representation. The problem is when we need that colorimetric control, evaluation, accuracy, and so forth, such as in fine art reproduction. We don't have it. The way we have it in Capture One, the way we have it in Hasselblad's Focus software for their digital camera captures. So that's really disappointing. Printing on a Mac is held back, is compromised compared to printing out of Windows OS. We do not have the ability, the way we have in Photoshop or Lightroom, to stipulate output profiles and the transitions, the rendering intents, and other considerations before going into the OS print path where we issue those instructions. That front half is missing on a Mac in Affinity. Now, that doesn't affect us because we don't print through the OS print paths. Why would we be so compromised? We work with professional printing software, applications, Mirage, Serendipity, Megarip, and the like, to enable us to go above and beyond those limitations and the variability and the instability of our OS print paths, especially on a Mac. All right, so there's just a few observations, a few considerations, not just how to think about what we're doing, but the actual process compared to Photoshop, which is showing its age and smartening it up with AI assistance. It really doesn't address any of the underlying problems, the inconsistencies and the workarounds to solve those imponderables and those, why on earth, Photoshop, do you do such stupid things? Here is how we fix it. Here's how we extract luminosity so points on the curve actually stay in place. So much of that's solved in Affinity Photo. And I finish this by alluding to what we have said for a long time, that Affinity is the Photoshop we always wished we had, but never really had. Now, here's an interesting dot point. And as is so often the case, these questions about the appropriateness or availability of file formats that we store, archive our data in, let alone work on and with our data, these questions often don't arise until we hit one of those brick walls. And suddenly, no, I'm sorry, your file, for whatever reason, has exceeded the ability to be contained within this format. So what I thought might be helpful is to look at the statistics. They're easily sourced, but let's put them all together in a single table so that we can easily compare how they enable and how they promulgate, if you like, what it is we need to do, but then turn that into real-world outcomes in terms of how I might go about then investing in prioritizing certain file formats over others. For example, on the left-hand side, I've just listed TIFF versus the big TIFF format, Photoshop's default PSD file format, and its large document PSB format. But TIFF, for example, is in a sense owned by Adobe, but open source. You can get the specifications for TIFF and DNG, the history of, but also the most recent iterations of these file formats from Adobe themselves. They're open specifications. Then the archivists say this is a chance that in the future, above and beyond proprietary file formats like .NEF, like .CR2, and so on, these are open specifications which, from an archiving point of view, way into the future, or maybe not so far into the future, the way things are going, that's your best chance to be able to access that raw data or access that processed data. And I certainly have TIFF files that are more than 30 years old that I can open in the latest Photoshops, the latest Affinities. I can process them right here, right now, even though they were made and archived and saved way back then. But there are limitations. For example, what comes first? Do you hit a theoretical maximum file size? And not all applications will actually enable a TIFF to get to 4 gigabytes either. That's a maximum theoretical possible file size. But also, how do you get there? Do you exceed the pixel dimensions? TIFF, 30,000 pixel dimensions? My goodness gracious me, even if I'm not on a 150 megapixel phase 1 digital back or 400 megapixel multi-shot Hasselblad, how many pictures do I need to stitch together in a pano to effortlessly exceed 30,000 pixels? Not many, not many at all. In fact, the 23,000 pixels that a multi-shot, 6-shot Hasselblad file renders is almost exceeding that pixel dimension. I'd only need to stitch 2 of those images together and it could not be archived as a TIFF file. Look at PSD. Now, the difference between PSD and TIFF is that PSD employs, without giving you any consent, the ability to compress the file. It uses a specific compression algorithm, run length encoding, but it gives you no ability or no say over that. It certainly is lossless, which is wonderful, but the maximum size is now only about 2 gigabytes, and the pixel dimensions remain unchanged. Of course, we can apply all sorts of compression to a TIFF file as well. LZW, zip compression, lossless and lossy compression as well. But the idea of saving a TIFF file without any compression means the data, the RGB triplets representing each location in the pixel grid, only minimum interpretation is needed in order to interpret that data in the future. And I'm also using PSD and PSB as examples of proprietary data. Now, while TIFF, thanks to Adobe, was taken up and has been widely supported for all sorts of complicated reasons, and I'm sure other reasons I don't even understand, DNG, that open specification for raw data, was never taken up with the same volition and urgency and desire that TIFF was. It's complicated. Certainly some cameras use DNG as their native file storage format, not a proprietary file format for raw data. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But the trauma is, and I encountered this just the other day, looking for images of Andre building his large rear projection screen, and they're all shot on a Sigma digital camera, raw data. And in the archive, I had never saved the processed TIFF files. And this is only 10 years ago. I froze for a second, go, oh no, it's okay. That application is still on another computer in our studio, and I can still open those files, and I'd better do that and save them, archive them as TIFF files, if for nothing more than the historical relevance to Andre's life and his artistic career, let alone going down memory lane for the likes of myself. And what if Nikon went bust? In your lifetime, let alone your children's lifetimes, will you still be able to access NEF encoded, encrypted raw data? Now, some of the features though, TIFF is universal. It's widely supported. I don't know if I've ever gone into any application that doesn't enable a TIFF file, 8-bit, 16-bit, or even 32 bits these days. So its compatibility is right across. Now, if we're comparing the large document format versus the big TIFF format, more than 4 gigabytes and way beyond 30,000 pixels, but PSB tops out at 300,000 pixels, massive files. Theoretically, we're not talking gigabytes, we're talking exabytes, way beyond a billion gigabytes. But PSB has only been supported since 2003 in Photoshop. It's 22 years now, but still, it's interesting when it came into being. Yes, massive sizes are possible, but its support is limited. Affinity Photo can now open and work with PSD files. So though being Adobe-centric in the first, second, and third instance, we now have applications like Affinity, more than happy. Big TIFF though, even though it's capable of extraordinary large files, both in pixel dimensions, but also in bits, it's quite limited support. And even though contemporary TIFF file formats can save a lot of things we do in a program like Photoshop, masks and transparencies and things like that, they're not always equally well supported in non-Adobe products, although to some extent they are. It's just where there are proprietary specializations that aren't replicated identically in another application. That's where we trip over. But in my experience, there's quite limited support for big TIFF. Not in MATLAB and other scientific applications, of course, but in our generic day-to-day graphics processing. Anyway, there's a few observations, but I finish on DNG again. A 4 gigabyte maximum file size, that's big. For raw data, 150 megapixel phase 1, 400 megapixel multi-shot Hasselblad H6D, and so on. But a pixel dimension of only 65,536 pixels, east-west or north-south. Now, okay, I don't know in my world of a digital capture system, scanner or camera system, that exceeds those dimensions. The fact that I can also store, let's say, the Hasselblad or Phase or Nikon actual raw data, not just metadata and not just conversion of binary data, but the actual encrypted data can also be stored inside that 4 gigabyte file size. From an archivist's point of view, This seems to be just a wonderful solution at the moment, but there's still some question marks about what of the original encrypted proprietary raw data are all of those nuances and subtleties and distinctions and advantages available. Can they be included inside the DNG format? Now, we find that the differences, for example, with the lens corrections in our Hasselblad software, perfecting not just corner-to-corner contrast, but also the distortion in these lightweight but stunningly beautiful Hasselblad lenses. We find when we process them in another application like Lightroom, we end up with almost identical results, but not absolutely identical results. We end up with, for all intent and purposes, identical enough results, but not absolutely identical. In other words, we might process that file with that particular wide-angle lens with the distortion corrections applied in focus software for our Hasselblads. We render that out as a TIFF file, exactly the same pixel dimensions, bit depth, color space. We then do the same thing in Lightroom, for example, Camera Raw. We render it out exactly the same pixel dimensions, same working color space, etc., with the same corrections applied for that particular lens, maybe the 24mm, and then we overlay them in Photoshop, blend on difference, and you'll see, oh, really close, but they don't fit exactly. Okay, there's rounding off errors and all manner of other computational considerations contributing to those slight differences. But when you just look at the image, those bookshelves are perfectly flat and straight from left to right and so on. It works. But it's interesting because there's still a lingering question that we can't answer because we have only tested this for our camera systems. But there's still a question mark in a lot of people's minds as to whether all of the secret sauce, all of the metadata that is proprietary and used in the proprietary processing of those proprietary raw files, how much of that does come across. But as I just demonstrated verbally, it's so simple to test and satisfy yourself that what matters for yourself can be saved. Anyway, there's just a quick overview of some of the ways we think about these 5 or so different file formats, and the appropriateness for our workflows is as follows. While we might archive our raw data as a .dng file, the same image with the same title then gets processed and, let's say, saved as a PSB file, Photoshop large document, with all of our Photoshop layers and adjustments and filters and what have you applied to it. So the same image with the same name, whatever the metadata we apply at that top level is, it then has a .psb designation. And then the flattened file, the file that we say this is the final rendering, the final performance of all those steps in the PSD/PSB file. We're working with PSB files, of course, because we're working with massive megapixel captures to begin with. That TIFF file, even if we don't put print ready or final as an addendum in the file name, we know just looking at the top level of metadata in our Windows Explorer or Finder on a Mac, we know exactly what those 3 files of the same name, the same image, represent. So there's a really simple little cataloging system that is another form of tagging and color coding and everything else that goes with it. Of course, we still put our 01, 02, 03, 04 in the iterations that we go through for ourselves or our friends that we work with to help them render their files according to their needs and desires and interests and so on. But there's just some other ways of then putting those file format distinctions to work on our behalf, above and beyond just the preservation of what it is that we do within each of those file formats. Now, here's a fascinating dot point. My friend who raised this with me has done our Understanding Pictures workshop, has done our Crafting a Digital Print/Digital Image workshop, both online but also in person. So I was able to answer his question quite perfunctorily because he already knows them. He's already working with these distinctions, such as the distinction between our drawing, tonal and color compositions, the distinction between our spatial and temporal compositions, and so on. So I was able to talk in a language that he already understood and thereby cut to the chase, as the saying goes, even more efficiently and more productively. But let's pull back just for a moment, assuming that you haven't done those other workshops yet, such as Understanding Pictures, which gives you the lexicon and the nomenclature to then package your understanding, let alone your application, let alone the outcomes of your pictorial endeavors into both historical, but also just really facilitating ways, points of departure, and so forth. So this idea of contrast, he understood it well because he does a lot of black and white photography. But you also talk about color contrast. What on earth is going on here? Let alone, how do I work with color contrast? I know how to apply luminosity curve to adjust tonal contrast, but what on earth is this color contrast? All right, let's look at a couple of examples to try and simplify this, but at the same time announce what it is that we're interested in doing and why we've got these distinctions in the first place: aesthetic, pictorial, and otherwise. And let's start with my favorite of Andre's still cinema series, as exhibited, all 3.2 meters using the rear projection screen. And he's edited this with such care and concern to infuse emotional nuance, depth, moments. Look at the blush on her cheek. Look at her two eyes hiding behind, looking beyond. Look at that gesture. The mouth is saying something totally different to the nostril, to the nose, to the eyebrow, to the etc., etc. This is the intent. And therefore the contrast between warm colours and cool colours, the contrast between pinks and mauves and yellows and oranges and reds. Look at the different lighting, the different coloration running through her face. It's a map of difference. Now, all right, to kick off this concept of colour contrast as opposed to tonal contrast, remembering, for example, our crafting a digital print workshop, that separation of the image into its tonal composition, its colour composition, and its drawing composition. There is the drama in the image. That's what the tonal composition represents. And the contrast, the difference, and the gradations, smooth flowing versus hard, decisive transitions throughout the image. Look at how the lipstick, the nostrils, the eyes commune a single unified message. Whereas in the colour composition, we are going backwards and forwards, past and present, simultaneously. Completely different mood versus drama, emotional effects. That's contrast, the difference between the drama, the tonal composition, and the mood, the personality, the colour composition. What about colour contrast within the colour composition? The way Andre has conspired these opposites on the colour wheel. All right, let's clean up those differences. And here's my HSL properties. Let's turn that on before and after. Now, remember images, understanding pictures 101, from figures on grounds, and grounds become figures on grounds, and on it goes. So I have two undertakings. One is the expansion of the color contrasts, the difference between colors, pushing them not together but apart in the ground, in the background, and the harmonizing of the color difference in the figure, in the moment, her thoughts, feelings, past and present. Now let's investigate. Global, a big shift in both the saturation and the hue. I am both extending the difference, but also, because the figure is predominantly in the red and yellow channels, having extended the saturation globally for the sake of the background, I've then adjusted the hue of the reds and adjusted the saturation of the reds and yellows, not just to restore the figure's emotional projection, but in order to have an even greater separation between the color contrast in the figure and the enhanced color contrast in the background. So that's just a really simple example with a single figure ground relationship, by bringing the differences closer together in the figure to create less discord within the figure and a greater unction between the figure, her presence, her meaning, her projection, and the ground. Off, she's in our world. She's being whisked away into another world, not of our making, of our dreams, desires, or otherwise. Now, that's a simple example. But to push this a little further, if I jump into 3D LUT Creator, here's the same image, but without the HSL adjustment layer. And of course, a vector scope shows me where the elements are in color space. And in 3D LUT, I've got different color models that prioritize how brightness and saturation change relative to one another. But when it comes to color contrast, let's go to our rectangular grid and increase the nodes to 24 by 24. And let's also pin our neutrals while leaving all of our other nodes unpinned for the moment. Now let's identify where some elements are, like her blonde hair and her cheek, remembering an AB grid of the LAB color model maps hue against intensity or colorfulness, with neutrality being pinned in the middle. Here's the background. There is a range of lesser greens compared to the cyan blues. Here in 3D Look Creator, because I have grids, because I have nodes, because I have a vector scope, I can do that with her hair, and I can do that with her skin, and then I can do this with the ground, dramatically pushing apart the color separation, dramatically changing these elements, and then removing and applying some other variations with that sensibility being pushed somewhere else, and moving further away from her hair and removing and enhancing. And suddenly she is transformed into yet a third dimension. She's both present here while the cacophony of time and space and desire and tragedy oscillating in the background. And let's push those even further apart. Now she's coming and going, immersed, but also emerging from, all done within seconds. Because I've got a vector scope, I can visualize, and I've got nodes to enable me to preserve or do whatever it is that I need to do with what I'm doing. So there's a couple of quick examples trying to clarify what we take in the color composition to mean when we talk about the color contrast. Andre begins on the color wheel with a ground and a figure that are more or less diametrically opposed on the color wheel. You can't have more conflict than that. But then we go into the figure and into the ground and look at harmonizing or doing the opposite in different areas. Also within the figure, hair versus cheek versus eye versus neck versus shoulder and so forth, to decrease or increase their difference, their contrast, what they represent, the range of outcomes that the contrast is a stand-in or another way of saying. But without the nomenclature, let alone the template framework, if you like, of the structural compositions, the things that pictures are made up out of, that we turn into meaning. But without those critical distinctions, we have no points of departure. We have no basis to judge, does this need to be more colourful or less colourful? A contrast expanded between the warm or the cools or the hards or the softs and so on. All right, hopefully there's something there of interest and help. And let's do a bit of revision, a bit of a recap from some of our printing workshops about the distinctions, material and psychological, between the incredible range of media that we have to print on today, and in particular focusing on media that we typically will use in fine art printmaking, as we call it. And if we look at just one family of papers, such as Canson Affinity, yes, we do have some commercial offerings. We have an expanded range of what we call photographic papers, our gloss, soft gloss, semi-gloss, fibre-based and rag-based papers like Platine, fibre rag, Baryta, photographic, both gloss and matte variations. And then, of course, the incredible range of fine art papers, both Fredrinia made but also mould-made papers from the Arsh Mill and the Somerset Mill in the UK that Canson own and operate. Legendary papers, such incredible options. Now, we can begin, as we do in some of the workshops, with more analytical appraisals, classifications of aspects of their materiality. We then have to turn these numerical values into aesthetic and pictorial judgments. So we jump into the digital fine art printmaking workshop from its introductory session. These paper characteristics, the 5 key distinctions by which we can describe physically these material considerations, but also use to describe something else. Translate metaphysically into aesthetic and other worldly outcomes. Let's look at what I call, for better or for worse, paper partners. And if I've only got 1 or maybe 2 papers to work with, can you give me some ideas? Let's look at translating those material qualities: mold-made, matte surface, textured, warm white, pure white, warm tone, cold tone. I want to print on a beautiful, legendary fine art paper, mold-made, 100% cotton. It has the imprimatur the art historical status, the archival status, but I now photographically have a choice between, let's just say, warm white and let's just say cool white versions of the same paper. Same texture, same bulk, same dimensionality, same presence, except one is racing towards me and the other is slowly ebbing away. For example, here are the LAB values, M1 measurement mode on our beautiful Konica Minolta FD7 spectrodensitometer, and there's a simulation of the warm white and the pure white, the slightly cooler white. Remembering there's no optical brightness here. This is all done with pigments. The natural warm tone of cotton plus pigmentation, and we're losing not even 1% brightness of that paper with carefully selected and applied pigmentation to give it that cool, crisp, beautiful rendering with the legendary status and dimensionality of BFK Reefs. So there's a simple distinction. Warm tone, cold tone, state-of-the-art fine art printing paper. A very textured warm white and a very textured cool white paper. And look at the patterning. And again, look at our B channel. Very warm tone, as you can see, and beautifully clean, cool tone. And as we demonstrate in the workshops, all we're looking at is warm paper white versus cool paper white. Just look at how those LAB numbers sit on that page. Look at how the cool tone acrylic rag, despite its texture coming forward, increased texture comes forward, the coolness sits back, and those numbers to me seem to be floating in space. The font, if anything, seems to be smaller than that used on the warm tone version, but it's not. I can vouch for it. Whereas the warm tones and the texture of this warm tone version, of course, we've now got the Somerset watercolor rag paper with an even more beautiful texture, just comes forward and pushes the LAB numbers in our face. Oh my goodness gracious me, they're not receding into the distance and therefore giving a quieter, compassionate, lilting feel to the image. Black text on paper, whereas on the left it's urgent, it's passionate, it's here and the now, pressing into the future. You can see it as plain as day. And of course, if you look at the paper samples that we send to everyone attending the Digital Fine Art Printmaking workshop, the annotated paper samples, in your own viewing conditions, it's larger than life. What about really smooth toned fine art papers? From the Fredriniere, 100% cotton, no optical brightness, the beautifully smooth, close to a neutral, slightly warmer than the D50 standard in our printing world of printing, to the slightly cooler Arch 88 with the smoothest surface I've ever found when it comes to 100% mold-made papers, traditionally made papers. We have, again, a warm tone versus cold tone version of these beautiful smooth surface, but 100% cotton rag papers. And again, just look at the text and where it sits and how the Arch 88. If the paper is the ground, the figure is now floating in space. Look at the urgency of rag photographic. Now we're talking about two different classes of paper. A photographic paper, our favorite platine fiber rag, and beautiful, also Fredriniere made, smooth surface matte paper, whose white points are virtually identical. So I have exactly the same urgency, exactly the same paper color, exactly the same empathy, compassion, presence, and dimensionality, except I have an incredibly unique and beautiful soft gloss surface with an enormous gamut and an enormous D-max, maximum black, on the same effective paper white, compared to the lilting, the calmness, the gentleness, the compassion of a rag photographic print. What a juxtaposition. Matte, fine art, soft gloss, photographic. Now photographic pairs platine fiber rag, which doesn't have a baryta undercoat. Unlike the fiber base, where the alpha cellulose is not particles, as in cotton paper, but they're at the level of a molecule, so the paper is already very smooth with a barium sulfate white pigment, baryta coating, filling in any tiny undulations in the already incredibly smooth fiber paper base compared to the texture, subtle as it is, of the rag base that you can feel on the back of those paper samples and comes through to the surface itself, giving this incredible presence, especially in very large prints. and smooth areas. Two completely different renderings of very beautiful photographic papers. Slightly glossier compared to slightly more textured surface, but definitely warmer than the coolness of the Baryta 2. Rag Photo and Baryta 2. And on it goes. Baryta Photographique 2, glossy versus matte. Exactly the same paper, same white points, incredibly smooth surfaces, same fiber base, same Baryta subcoating, but with a perfectly matte surface. That is the sharpest paper we've ever encountered compared to the traditional photographic darkroom look-alike gloss surface. And on it goes. Arch 88 and the matte paper, similar cool white points, but completely different presentation characteristics. Acryl versus Arch 88, pure white versus pure white, but heavily textured versus super smooth, both mold-made papers. These are all, as we call them, paper pairs, ways of contrasting, using our material distinctions, our famous fives, to name, identify differences, but at the same time to then emotionally respond to those differences. Write them down. Think about them as tendencies. Do I go left? Do I go right at each crossroad? Paper color, warmer, cooler, neutral. We always start on a very neutral paper. Platine, for example, with our photographic papers. And then we ask the question and we soft proof, warmer, cooler. Immediately you see that face, that place, that territory, whatever your image is, it just starts transporting you. And immediately, with those distinctions already embedded in your intuitive response to the materiality and the structure of these papers, you immediately translate them into aesthetic and other pictorial considerations that are of real importance, rather than just it being textured, rather than it just being mold-made or smooth, cool white or warm white. They're emotional considerations of a kind that matter above and beyond anything else. But that also means you've got the distinctions. And when we look at our annotated paper samples, such as those from the Digital Fine Art Printmaking Workshop, and start comparing the Arch 88 and the Somerset Enhanced Satin 330 GSM, I can really feel the difference. But warm tone, cold tone. Look at the presence, the dimensionality in this case starts to erupt. Oh, BFK. What about BFK versus Somerset Enhanced Velvet? Even more texture and patterning on the surface. And Acryl and Enhanced Watercolor Rag. And we start looking at these textural differences. Oh, look at the stochastic patterning on the Acryl Rag. And look at the more preordained texture on the beautiful watercolor rag. We start seeing these incredible differences, these opportunities, aesthetic and otherwise. And so we have this plethora of opportunities and abilities. And we just bring our proof prints into the mix. And immediately some of the qualities that we really admire start to jump out and announce themselves and say, oh, I want you to be part of this, and on the distinctions flow. So hopefully a little bit of revision there, but also maybe an extension for some of you above and beyond what we go on about, especially in the Digital Fine Art Printmaking Workshop, that will help you add a little more nous, a little more nuance to those decisions, aesthetic, procedural and otherwise, that you invoke when it comes to the selection of media to enhance your images. And over time, they assume a level of intuition, perhaps, within one, so that create a new image, and maybe even at the time of capture, you're already thinking BFK Reeves, pure white. You're already seeing that image pre-visualized as emanating from a particular combination of material qualities to enhance its other qualities, the thoughts, feelings, things on our side of the lens, that often, at least for us, is the whole reason we construct and photograph the image in the first place. Now, to finish off, let's have a look at combining those last two dot points. This idea of masking different domains, colorimetric, spatial, frequency domains in particular, and blending, and applying that to our workshop actions. Now, these questions came from our Adobe Photoshop Masterclass, so I'll do this in Photoshop. And I'll try and combine into a single demonstration these considerations, and hopefully they will then serve as a not just how to think about such things, but a way forward. And I'll use this image because it's an image that I make great use of in some of those workshops to demonstrate the efficacy of some of our macros in Affinity and workflow actions in Photoshop. Now there's the background image. And what have I got there? A depth map. Okay, how did you make that? Of course, even in Photoshop, I go into our neural filters. We've got a depth blur. And if we choose focus as the main criteria and then output just the depth map and output it as a separate layer, there it is, where we have, according to density, what the neural filter has identified as being spatially different areas of the image. The lighter it is, the further away. The darker it is, it's closer. Of course, it's missed the diving board. It's not perfect, but it's certainly, I would suggest, helpful, at least as a starting point when we're separating in the spatial domain. So that's how I created that mask. But the second question was also about seeing in another tutorial, me working on one of the images that was submitted for the black and white digital image workshop. And my friend was wondering what I might do with this. So the first thing was extract LAB lightness and preserve that as an RGB file, using from that workshop our lightness separation action to enhance the mist and feeling of the Alps and the snow gums. Then I applied, and this is what she was particularly interested in, I applied our enhanced shadow separation action and blended on our various darkening blending modes. And you can see how I'm intensifying what this action has separated out in the tonal domain, intensifying its presence, for example, off and on. And then we applied various historical toning LUTs from the history of black and white photography, Edward Steichen, for example, to add some historical preeminence and authority. But that's where this came from. And she said, wow, this is amazing. It just makes such a difference to what I'm doing with my images and how I can treat such images. What else can you do with such things? Here we are in Photoshop with the Ripponlea swimming pool, a favorite demonstration image of ours, because look, the drawing composition, the tonal and the color compositions are so pronounced, architectural forms and forms of nature and so on. So we've got ourselves a depth map, not yet applied as a mask to do anything. What have I got here? Frequency separation. I've divided the frequency of the image, the different ranges of frequency, texture if you like. There's the mid frequencies, then I'm putting in the high frequencies and I turn those off and I've got the very low frequencies. I've used a frequency separation filter if I go to the background image and onto my filters menu, remembering Photoshop perhaps at its absolute best is all of the plugins that enables us to use to activate from within. Let's use one of the Retouch for Me plugins. What about their frequency separation filter where the low, medium and the medium high, let's generate as black and white because we're going to use it as a mask and take out the low and the mid frequencies and at 100% the high frequencies. So there's all the high frequency textures. And I turned on make layers and hit apply. And consequently, I end up with low frequencies, the mids and the high frequencies. I've attached to these frequency domain separations RGB curves, which I can edit the distribution of spatial domain frequency separation in the image, modifying how that frequency is applied, but to keep it simple in this example, using one of our contrast blending modes, for example, vivid light. Can you see the enhancement? Let's zoom in and turn off that curve, which is contrast blending. Let's turn that off and on. And we can turn everything off and see what it is that we're applying. And this is just at 50% for the moment. And let's have a look at this curve on soft light, an S curve rather than a very abrupt straight line vivid light transition from shadows to highlights with middle gray not being affected. Therefore, a more gentle enhancement of mid-tone frequencies, the shape of the benches or the buoy over here and so on. Then I did a merge visible layer. Adding a layer mask, in my case, I went into my HAL 9000 robotic hands and I chose the depth map and multiplied and inverting it So now the mask applies the attenuated, enhanced frequency separation more in the foreground than in the midground, and not at all in the distant background. Let's turn that mask off, and that looks pretty good, but this is overdone. Look at the effect on the tessellated tiles. So let's shift click and turn that mask back on. I turn everything off, everything on. So I now, by using the spatial domain, in cahoots with the drawing composition, those lines which go in different directions and cross over and make shapes of different sizes, interestingly and otherwise, let alone the tonal contrast, the tonal gradations, the drama in the image, let alone the mood, the personality, the color composition, its color contrast and other juxtapositions. But why stop there while you're having fun? Because of course this is just a black and white image. In Photoshop, masks are pixel images. And if I select my paintbrush, painting with white on the mask and zooming in on this statue, and then just start enhancing some of these shapes and dimensions, bringing that forward. Look, just bing, bing, bing with 100% white. As I like to say, you don't even need a certificate in finger painting from kindergarten to do this stuff. Our beautiful lenses have already drawn the world for us in the most remarkable of ways, if our camera craft is up to it. And now I turn that mask off and on. Look at the spatial enhancement and separation right here in front of us. So there's another example of combining, blending our frequency separation actions and our spatial domains, depth maps, combining them into an overall effect that is so easily achieved here, but impossible to even conceive of in a Capture One or Lightroom, rather than working in our different domains to divide and conquer and to provide quite extraordinary solutions, both in terms of productivity and efficiency, but also sanity. So I can spend the majority of my time thinking about what I'm doing, because I'm in the process of not taking an image, but creating an image. Remember, finding something in order to make a photograph of it versus making something in order to discover and not just find, but refine what it is that I'm doing it on behalf of my aesthetic judgments. So hopefully there's a few observations and hints that may help you think about this recombinatory way of working that certainly the Photoshops and Affinities of the world enable us to do. But at the heart of the matter, where that construction of that rendering of thoughts, feelings, associations, ideas, cares and concerns into the literalness of the image, to challenge, enhance, develop the missing spatial and temporal compositions from our everyday three-dimensional habitation and agency within our worlds, to imbue all of that into an otherwise still silent photographic image, with the authority of a photographic image, but with intent no different to any of the other arts in terms of what it is we are trying to project, offer, share, and hope that along the way you or someone else might get something from it, be able to do something else with our endeavors, which really is the biology of survival, to do something else with what we have done to inspire or educate or just enable you to go on above and beyond what it is that you're already doing. Anyway, that's the hope. As always, lovely to catch up. Wonderful to spend this time together. Thank you for the company. Thank you for the questions. Always welcome. I look forward to seeing you at another tutorial on another Sunday morning down here in Melbourne every week of the year, in support of you and your support of us for your consultations and the workshops you do with us as we try and refine and do a better job of everything we're already doing, sharing and contributing to your good selves, not just ourselves. Take care. All the best with your adventures in photography. See you soon. Cheers.